Amy Goodman, former co-host with White on WBAI's morning show called Wake Up Call, talks about her experience with White as co-host. Goodman went on from that program to become co-host with Daily News columnist Juan Gonzalez of Pacifica Radio's Democracy Now!, a hard-hitting news and international public affairs program now broadcast weekdays on 500 radio and TV stations around the country.
We really hadn't worked much before together. I had known him because of his incredible work every Martin Luther King Day when you'd see him trundling down the hallways of the old WBAI with hundreds of the LPs, carrying them and the tapes falling out of his pockets and his bag. No matter whether he lived in New York or whether he lived in Richmond, he was committed to bringing out the words that were not so often heard of Dr. Martin Luther King, not the most famous speeches, but the speeches, the conversations, the discussions about Dr. King that so enrich our lives on WBAI that Bernard has really made possible for the last 20 years. Bernard's a teacher, and he always has been. It hasn't changed being a broadcaster, a journalist. That is what he is first and foremost. He has taught me so much, so many days of so many months of so many years, as he has so many people, and also made me laugh and made me cry. Bernard and I talk about the magic moments we shared together over the years of Wake Up Call, like the time with Maurice Bickham, the remarkable man who spent decades in prison in Angola, the prison named for the country where the men had been brought enslaved in this country, the plantation prison in Louisiana, 5,000 prisoners held there. Maurice had been there for decades. He had been arrested and imprisoned, given the death penalty for, then Louisiana had thrown out the death penalty, and so he was no longer on death row, but he was there, then back on death row, but still there, for killing 2 sheriff's deputies who come to his home in the middle of the night in their pajamas, members of the Klan who had tried to kill him, and in self-defense he had shot out. And Bernard was relentless. It wasn't just one program. It was talking to people about Maurice, and then finally getting Maurice on the phone, and then getting Maurice and his daughter and his granddaughter and all on the telephone as people called in from all over the country saying they were crying as they listened. And finally the day, it was Martin Luther King's Day on WBAI, that Maurice Bickham came into our studio after he ultimately, from the pressure from all of you, from the WBAI audience, from Bernard and Errol working so incredibly hard, was free. That's the power of WBAI. That's the power of Bernard White, who stays in the midst of struggle, knowing what he stands for. He always says, stay strong and pay close attention, and it is beautiful here to see everyone standing with Bernard and saying, stay strong. Thank you, Bernard.
But White's policies, and particularly his support of continuing role for programs based on a strong independent black community focus, have earned him the enmity of some on the local WBAI station board. Board member Steve Brown wrote in an August 2005 email sent to hundreds of subscribers, hundreds of listeners, quote, "You and I and hundreds of others have all begged and pleaded with Indra Hardat, the WBAI interim station manager, to fire you-know-who. But now it is time to go a step further and actually provide Indra with a blueprint to help rebuild the station after she hopefully cleans house," close quote. Likening his idea to a Vietnam-era grassroots war crimes tribunal, Brown goes on to propose violating board rules to form an unauthorized committee to find a new program director. Brown's repeated public statements against White and other staff members at the station has led to a strong repudiation by the WBAI local station board, in a motion passed by the board in March of this last year, the board disassociated itself from many of Brown's public statements, including what the board called racist stereotypes, crudely offensive language, and unsubstantiated allegations of violent behavior by Bernard White and Errol Maitland. Calls for violence against Bernard White. Quote, "You should have been at her side whacking Bernard with a baseball bat," close quote. And a statement that Mr. White's actions are worse for WBAI than those of Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, and George Bush combined, close quote.
Whereas in a series of public emails sent to many WBAI listeners over many months, WBAI local station board member Steve Brown has engaged in an unrelenting campaign of vitriolic accusations against management, staff, and listeners of WBAI that damage the credibility of the station through innuendo with no basis in fact, thereby injuring staff morale, contributing to a climate of fear and mistrust at WBAI, and undermining fundraising efforts. Therefore, be it resolved that the LSB disapproves of and disassociates itself from the aforesaid public statements by board member Steve Brown, and calls on all LSB members to desist from making statements that prejudge the performance of WBAI management personnel, indulge in personal attacks on management and staff, and undermine listener financial support for the station.
Among the numerous criticisms of Brown is his letter to general manager of a Pacifica affiliate station in Colorado called KGNU, which he put forth what the board termed a, quote, race-based analysis of KGNU's success and WBAI's failure, close quote. In the email, Brown says, quote, how much of WBAI's almost willful self-destructiveness over the past 15 to 20 years, up to and including the last 3 years during which internal strife, mistrust, nastiness, and violence and extreme interpersonal antagonism have brought the station to the brink of bankruptcy and near total meltdown, is solely and entirely due to the tensions, frictions, and politics of race. Which leads to the corollary question, how much of the success of KGNU, not counting, of course, the part that your leadership and the efforts of your staff and listeners have played, has been to an almost total absence of the tensions, frictions, and politics of race. Countries like Japan and Scandinavia that are racially homogenous have never, though they have other problems, been crippled by racially generated strife, as have the United States, Britain, and France, and lately Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, Spain, Italy, and Switzerland, which used to be racially homogenous, but now contain large, undigested populations of foreign, third world laborers, primarily people of color who have been imported to do the unpleasant work that their own citizens no longer wish to do. New York mirrors the racial diversity of U.S. society as a whole, and WBAI, if anything, magnifies that diversity. Consequently, it is no surprise that WBAI, which has always been a pressure cooker of racial mistrust, nastiness, and violence, and extreme interpersonal antagonism, has finally, and perhaps irretrievably, blown its top, close quote. Brown quotes statistics that indicate that the Boulder area where KGNU is located is 88.3% white. And then he continues, quote, as a result, KGNU does not seem to have been plagued by the racial antagonisms that for so long prevented WBAI from getting out of its own way, close quote. In closing, he writes, quote, so I ask you, could racial tension, or rather the absence of it, be one of the most important reasons for KGNU's success and WBAI's failure, close quote. The board passed the motion of disassociation from Steve Brown's statement by a vote of 10-1. Critics of Brown also point out that his many unsubstantiated assertions and factual errors undermine the confidence in the station and make it more difficult to raise funds. At that same March meeting, Program Director Bernard White said,
these emails that go all over the country and to our listenership do just that. They don't close WBAI down, but it does begin to eat into our ability to sustain ourselves.